In 2009, construction workers preparing ground for a new road in Weymouth, Dorset, England, uncovered something that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Viking raiders. Beneath the coastal soil lay 54 bodies, all male, all powerful warriors, and every single one had been decapitated. But this wasn't battlefield carnage. The bodies had been arranged methodically, the heads placed separately, the entire burial executed with ritual precision. These weren't casualties of war, but victims of mass execution, killed far from their Scandinavian homelands and denied the warrior's death they'd spent their lives preparing for. Their teeth had been deliberately filed into horizontal grooves. Their bones told stories of brutal training from childhood, and their DNA would reveal they'd come from across the Viking world to die together in a foreign land. This is the story of the Headless Vikings of Weymouth, warriors who lived by the sword but died by betrayal, and whose final resting place has become one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries. The spring of 2009 brought construction crews to a site near Weymouth, a coastal town in Dorset that had served as a port since Roman times. The area was scheduled for development, a new road to relieve traffic congestion through the historic town center. Archaeological surveys had revealed nothing particularly significant, so construction began with routine expectations. On a Thursday morning in May, heavy machinery excavating for road foundations encountered resistance at approximately 6 feet depth. The operator initially assumed bedrock, or perhaps remnants of old foundations, but when soil was cleared away, something unexpected emerged. Human bones. Lots of them, arrayed in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random burial. Work halted immediately. British law requires archaeological examination of any human remains encountered during construction. Oxford Archaeology was contacted, and within hours, Dr. David Score arrived with a team to assess the discovery. What they found transformed a routine construction delay into one of the decade's most significant archaeological discoveries. The burial pit measured approximately 15 feet square and had been excavated into the underlying chalk bedrock. Inside lay a mass grave containing 54 complete male skeletons, stacked and arranged with obvious organization. But the detail that made everyone pause was immediately apparent. Not a single body had its head attached. Every skull had been removed, and the heads had been piled separately at one side of the pit. Dr. Score's initial examination revealed several crucial details. The decapitations had been performed with remarkable precision, single, clean cuts through the cervical vertebrae, suggesting sharp, heavy blades wielded by someone who knew exactly where and how to strike. These weren't haphazard wounds, but professional executions. The cut marks came from the front rather than the back, indicating the victims had faced their executioners. The bodies showed no signs of defensive wounds, no broken bones from raised arms trying to ward off blows, no injuries suggesting struggle or resistance. This absence of trauma, beyond the decapitations, suggested the men had either been restrained or had accepted their deaths without fighting. The implications were disturbing. These were mass executions, carried out with methodical efficiency. Dating the burial required careful analysis, but initial assessments based on burial context and associated finds suggested the Viking Age, approximately the 10th or 11th century. This timing was significant because it corresponded with a period of intense conflict between Viking raiders and Anglo-Saxon defenders of England. The coastal location near Weymouth made strategic sense for a Viking landing site. What struck researchers immediately was the burial's nature. This wasn't a battlefield cemetery where casualties had been interred with respect. The bodies had been stripped completely. No clothing, no jewelry, no weapons, none of the grave goods typically accompanying Viking burials. They'd been thrown into a pit like refuse, denied the ship burials or elaborate ceremonies that Viking culture prescribed for honored warriors. The separation of heads from bodies carried specific significance in medieval belief systems. Many cultures held that severing the head prevented the dead from walking or returning as revenants. The practice appeared in execution contexts, where communities wanted to ensure the executed couldn't come back to haunt the living. But it also served practical psychological purposes. Displaying heads on stakes sent powerful messages about the fate awaiting raiders. The skeletal analysis began revealing the men's characteristics. They were predominantly young, late teens to early 30s, at the peak of physical capability. Their bones showed exceptional development of muscle attachments, particularly in shoulders, arms, and backs. These were men who'd spent their lives performing heavy physical labor, probably rowing the longships that had brought them across the North Sea. More detailed examination would wait for laboratory analysis, but even the field assessment suggested these weren't ordinary sailors or farmers caught up in Viking raids. The skeletal development, the evidence of healed combat injuries on several bodies, the sheer physical robustness. These were professional warriors, trained from youth for violence. As forensic anthropologists examined the Weymouth skeletons in laboratory conditions, they uncovered a biography written in bone. Stories of childhoods spent preparing for warfare, lives dedicated to physical prowess, and bodies that bore witness to the brutal realities of Viking martial culture. The shoulder blades showed particularly telling modifications. The muscle attachment points were massively developed, with bone ridges far more pronounced than in normal populations. This development came from specific activities, primarily rowing and wielding weapons. Viking longships required coordinated rowing by crews who might spend weeks at sea, pulling oars through Atlantic swells. The repetitive motion, sustained over years from adolescence, literally reshaped the skeleton. Arms and hands told similar stories. The right arms were typically more robust than the left, suggesting weapon dominance. The specific pattern of muscle development matched what would result from swinging axes and swords, weapons that required both power and precision. The hands showed grip strength development far exceeding normal ranges, suggesting thousands of hours holding weapon hafts, rope, and oars. Spinal analysis revealed the cost of this physical lifestyle. Multiple skeletons showed compression damage to vertebrae, particularly in the lower back. This wear pattern resulted from bearing heavy loads while maintaining unstable positions, exactly what occurred during rowing or standing in small boats on rough seas. Several showed signs of early degenerative changes that would have caused chronic pain, yet the men had continued their physically demanding lives despite discomfort. More revealing were the growth markers visible in long bones. During childhood and adolescence, periods of nutritional stress or illness leave permanent marks in bone structure called Harris lines. Many of the Weymouth skeletons showed such lines, indicating childhoods punctuated by hardship, seasons when food was scarce, winters when illness swept through communities, or simply the demanding training regimen that Viking warrior culture imposed on boys. Teeth provided additional biographical details. Dental enamel hypoplasia, defects in tooth enamel development, appeared frequently, confirming periods of stress or malnutrition during youth. But the teeth also revealed something more deliberate. Several individuals showed filed teeth. Someone had deliberately carved horizontal grooves into the anterior teeth, creating patterns that had no functional purpose. This practice of tooth filing fascinated researchers. Historical sources mentioned that some Viking warriors modified their teeth, possibly to create fearsome appearances in combat. The grooves might have been filled with colored resin, red being particularly favored, creating the visual effect of bloody teeth designed to terrorize opponents. The practice required considerable pain tolerance, as filing down enamel exposed sensitive inner tooth layers. The skeletons showed healed injuries that documented violent lives. Multiple individuals had suffered broken bones that had healed before death. One man's forearm showed a classic parry fracture, the type of break that occurs when raising an arm to block a descending blade. Another had a healed rib fracture, probably from blunt force trauma. These weren't fatal wounds, but rather accumulated scars of a profession where injury was routine. Height measurements revealed these men were tall by medieval standards, averaging around 5 feet 9 inches, significantly above contemporary English populations, who averaged 5 feet 6 inches. This height advantage, combined with exceptional physical strength, would have made them formidable opponents in hand-to-hand combat. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel provided information about childhood diet and location. Teeth form during childhood and preserve chemical signatures of the food and water consumed during formation. The Weymouth Vikings showed isotopic patterns inconsistent with growing up in England. Their signatures matched Scandinavian populations, confirming they'd spent their formative years in northern homelands before coming to England. More specifically, the marine isotope signatures were prominent, indicating diets heavy in seafood. This matched Viking cultural patterns. Coastal communities relied heavily on fishing, and marine protein formed a major part of Norse diet. The bone chemistry suggested these men had eaten fish regularly from childhood through their final days. Trace element analysis revealed another detail. These men had consumed significant amounts of ale or mead. Chemical markers in bone indicated regular alcohol consumption at levels suggesting either cultural practices around communal drinking or possibly self-medication to manage chronic pain from their demanding lifestyle. Understanding the Weymouth Vikings required understanding the bizarre and brutal customs that defined Norse warrior culture. These weren't mere raiders, but members of a society with complex spiritual beliefs, rigid codes of honor, and practices that seem alien to modern sensibilities. The filed teeth represented just one aspect of deliberate body modification. Viking warriors enhanced their appearance to create psychological advantages in combat. The practice served dual purposes: demonstrating toughness. Anyone who could endure having their teeth filed possessed exceptional pain tolerance, and creating fearsome visages that might make enemies hesitate or flee before weapons were even drawn. But body modification extended beyond teeth. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts describe elaborate tattoos covering Viking warriors' bodies. While tattoos don't preserve on skeletal remains, written descriptions by Arab travelers who encountered Vikings describe extensive body art featuring geometric patterns, animal motifs, and possibly runic inscriptions believed to possess magical protective properties. The runes themselves represented a complex symbolic system beyond simple writing. Each rune carried specific meanings and associations with Norse gods and cosmic forces. Warriors wore runic inscriptions on clothing, carved them into weapons, and possibly inscribed them on their own bodies, believing these symbols could influence fate, protect against harm, or channel divine power into combat. Central to Viking warrior identity was the cult of Odin, the All-Father god, associated with war, wisdom, and death. Odin's mythology promised that warriors who died in battle would be carried by Valkyries, divine female warriors, to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight eternally, until Ragnarok, the final battle at world's end. This belief system created warriors who actively sought death in combat as the highest honor. The concept of a good death permeated Viking culture. Dying in bed from illness or old age was shameful. It meant reaching the afterlife called Hell, rather than glorious Valhalla. This belief motivated seemingly suicidal bravery in battle. Warriors courted death, seeking to die with weapons in hand, facing enemies, demonstrating courage that would earn them eternal glory. Some warriors took this martial obsession to extremes, becoming berserkers, fighters who entered trance-like states of fury that made them immune to fear and pain. Historical accounts describe berserkers throwing off armor, howling like wolves or bears, biting their shields, and attacking with such ferocity that even fellow Vikings found them disturbing. Whether this state resulted from psychological conditioning, religious ecstasy, or possibly hallucinogenic substances remains debated. Viking religious practices before Christianization involved complex rituals, including animal sacrifice. The practice called blot involved offerings to gods, with blood from sacrificed animals sprinkled on altars, sacred groves, and participants. Major bloats occurred at seasonal festivals, before battles, or during crises. The rituals reinforced community bonds and sought divine favor for ventures. Funeral practices reflected beliefs about the afterlife. Wealthy warriors received ship burials, placed in vessels with weapons, grave goods, and sometimes sacrificed slaves or animals, then covered with earth mounds. The ship symbolized the journey to the afterlife. Less wealthy warriors received simpler burials, but still with weapons and goods needed in the next world. The complete absence of such goods with the Weymouth Vikings marked their burial as profoundly dishonored. Viking navigation demonstrated sophisticated knowledge combining practical seamanship with what they considered magical tools. The legendary sunstone, probably calcite crystals that could locate the sun's position even on cloudy days through light polarization, allowed navigation across open ocean. Combined with knowledge of stars, ocean currents, bird behavior, and wave patterns, Vikings could traverse vast distances without magnetic compasses. The culture's attitude toward women was complex and often contradictory. While patriarchal, Norse society granted women more legal rights than many contemporary cultures. Women could own property, divorce husbands, and in rare cases become warriors themselves. The famous shield maidens of legend may have had real historical counterparts, though evidence remains contested. Trade networks extended Viking influence far beyond raiding. Norse merchants traveled to Byzantium, traded in Middle Eastern markets, and established routes extending into Russia and Central Asia. This commercial activity brought exotic goods, cultural influences, and diverse genetic contributions back to Scandinavian homelands. Reconstructing the Weymouth Vikings' final moments required combining forensic evidence with historical context. The bones told a story of methodical execution, carried out with ritual precision, suggesting events governed by cultural codes rather than battlefield chaos. The forensic evidence indicated all victims died within a short time frame, probably a single day, possibly even hours. The absence of scavenger damage or weathering on the bones suggested the bodies were buried quickly after death. This coordinated timing implied organized execution rather than accumulated casualties from multiple encounters. The cutting marks on cervical vertebrae revealed technical proficiency. Decapitation isn't simple. The neck contains dense bone and tissue, requiring both sharp blades and knowledge of anatomy. The clean cuts through vertebrae, without significant hack marks, indicated executioners who knew exactly where to strike and possessed weapons capable of severing heads with single blows. The approach from the front was particularly significant. Many execution traditions involved beheading from behind, victims kneeling, facing away, presenting their necks to the executioner's blade. But the Weymouth Vikings' vertebrae showed cuts from anterior approaches, meaning they'd faced their killers. This suggested either a different execution protocol, or, more intriguingly, that the Vikings had demanded to face death, rather than turn away. Viking culture emphasized facing death with courage, Stories celebrated warriors who joked or composed poetry while dying, who met their end without flinching, who demonstrated the fearlessness that would earn them places in Valhalla. If the Weymouth Vikings had gone to execution believing they could still reach the honored afterlife, they might have insisted on facing their executioners, showing defiance and courage even in defeat. But the burial's nature suggested their executioners intended to deny them honored deaths. Stripping the bodies of all possessions, throwing them into a mass grave, separating heads from bodies, these actions systematically violated Viking funeral customs. The execution wasn't simply killing enemies, but ritually dishonoring them, ensuring they couldn't reach Valhalla, condemning them to shameful afterlife in hell. Why execute rather than enslave or ransom? Viking raiders were valuable. They could be sold as slaves, ransomed back to their communities, or integrated into local populations. Mass execution wasted potential economic value. The decision to kill all 54 men suggested either that ransom wasn't possible, or that the symbolic message of execution outweighed practical considerations. Historical context provides possible explanations. The early 11th century saw English King Aethelred the Unready's decision to massacre Vikings living peacefully in England, the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. This event, motivated by paranoia about Viking plots, killed unknown numbers of Scandinavian settlers. The Weymouth execution might have been retaliation for such atrocities, or part of the general atmosphere of ethnic violence characterizing the period. The separation of heads from bodies reflected beliefs about preventing the dead from walking. Medieval people across cultures feared revenants, corpses that rose from graves to haunt the living. Decapitation was considered effective protection against such supernatural threats. By removing heads and presumably displaying them, the executioners ensured the Vikings' spirits couldn't return to take revenge. The psychological dimension of mass execution is disturbing. How do you kill 54 men systematically? The process required organization, multiple executioners working in rotation, and psychological mechanisms allowing participants to kill prisoners who likely weren't actively resisting. The lack of defensive wounds suggests the Vikings either couldn't resist, perhaps bound or drugged, or chose not to, accepting death with the stoicism their culture demanded. One possibility is that the Vikings were already wounded or weakened from earlier combat. If they'd been captured after a raid or battle, injuries might have made resistance impossible. But the absence of healing on combat injuries argues against extended captivity. More likely, they were captured quickly and executed soon after. Among the many theories about the Weymouth Vikings' identity, one particularly compelling possibility involves the legendary Jomsvikings, a semi-mythical order of mercenary warriors whose reputation for fearlessness and martial skill echoed through medieval Scandinavia. The Jomsvikings, according to historical sources and sagas, were an elite warrior brotherhood based at Jomsborg, a fortress whose exact location remains debated, but was probably somewhere along the southern Baltic coast. They operated as professional soldiers of fortune, hiring their services to Scandinavian kings and engaging in raids across northern Europe. What distinguished them from ordinary Vikings was their rigid code of conduct and ruthless discipline. The Jomsvikings' legendary rules aligned eerily well with the Weymouth burial's evidence. Members were required to show no fear in battle, regardless of odds or circumstances. They couldn't flee combat, even when facing certain death. They were forbidden to speak words of fear or despair, even when wounded. Any member who violated these codes faced immediate expulsion or execution. This warrior culture that valued death over dishonor might explain why the Weymouth Vikings showed no defensive wounds. They'd faced execution with the stoicism their code demanded. Historical sources describe Jomsviking recruitment practices that created the warrior elite found at Weymouth. Boys were taken young, often as young as 12, and trained relentlessly in weapon skills, ship handling, and the mental discipline required to face death without flinching. The training was brutal, weeding out those who lacked physical prowess or psychological fortitude. Those who survived became living weapons, men who'd sacrificed normal life for martial excellence. The Jomsvikings were particularly associated with King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, who ruled from approximately 986 to 1014. Svein's invasions of England during this period sought to avenge his father's death and eventually place himself on the English throne, a goal he briefly achieved before dying suddenly. The Weymouth execution's timeframe coincides with Svein's campaigns, suggesting these warriors might have been part of his invasion forces. The saga accounts describe Jomsvikings' attitudes toward death that match the archaeological evidence. When captured, Jomsvikings supposedly joked with their executioners, showed contempt for their captors, and competed to die with the greatest courage. One famous saga passage describes captured Jomsvikings arguing about who should be executed first, each claiming he was least afraid. While such accounts are likely exaggerated, they reflect cultural ideals that might have influenced the Weymouth Vikings' behavior. Weapons found at similar Viking sites, though absent from Weymouth, included the distinctive Danish axe, a weapon particularly associated with elite warriors. These axes, with blades measuring 8 to 12 inches, could cleave through shields, helmets, and armor with devastating effect. The Weymouth Vikings' pronounced shoulder and arm development would have been ideal for wielding such weapons. The absence of grave goods at Weymouth takes on additional significance if these were Jomsvikings. Their code required members to abandon family ties and personal wealth. They owned nothing individually. All property belonged to the Brotherhood collectively. In death, they wouldn't have expected elaborate burials with rich grave goods, but rather the honor of dying well and being remembered in saga. The multi-ethnic composition revealed by later DNA analysis also fits the Jomsviking profile. The Brotherhood recruited from across Scandinavia and beyond, accepting any man who could meet their standards, regardless of origin. This created a cosmopolitan fighting force, united by shared code rather than ethnic identity. The Weymouth execution occurred during a pivotal period when Christianity's spread through Scandinavia collided with traditional Norse paganism, creating religious tensions that turned Viking raids into something resembling holy war. England had been Christian for centuries by the time Vikings first appeared in the late 8th century. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, often considered the Viking Age's beginning, shocked Christian Europe, partly because it targeted a sacred site. Vikings' willingness to plunder churches and monasteries wasn't simple greed, but reflected fundamentally different attitudes toward the sacred. What Christians considered sacrilege, Vikings saw as legitimate warfare against an alien god. The religious dimension intensified as some Vikings converted to Christianity, often superficially and for political advantage, while others remained devoted to Thor, Odin, and the old gods. This created complex allegiances where religion, ethnicity, and political loyalty no longer aligned neatly. An English Christian might face Viking Christians and pagan Vikings simultaneously, forcing difficult decisions about which enemies posed greater threats. The location of the Weymouth burial, near ancient boundaries, suggests territorial significance. Medieval people marked boundaries with ritual deposits and sometimes with executions intended to warn trespassers. The mass grave might have served as a macabre boundary marker, reminding other Vikings what awaited them if they landed on this coast. Documentary evidence describes violent English responses to Viking raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle documents St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when King Athelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England. The massacre's scope remains debated, but it clearly resulted in significant bloodshed and further inflamed Viking-English hostilities. The Weymouth execution might have been localized retaliation or part of broader anti-Viking violence. Church wealth made monasteries and cathedrals tempting targets. Vikings who practiced traditional Norse religion felt no compunction about stealing from Christian institutions. The raids enriched Viking chieftains, while enraging Christian populations who saw their sacred spaces desecrated. This cycle of raid and revenge created spiraling violence that claimed victims on both sides. The religious context also affected how medieval chroniclers recorded Viking activities. Christian writers portrayed Vikings as divine punishment for English sins, or as demonic enemies of true faith. These accounts must be read critically, recognizing bias and propaganda. Yet they also preserve genuine horror at Viking violence and determination to resist raiders, regardless of cost. Conversion attempts added another layer of complexity. Some Vikings converted sincerely, others merely performed Christian rituals while maintaining Norse beliefs, creating a syncretic religion, combining elements of both faiths. This religious ambiguity made identity and loyalty difficult to determine. Was a baptized Viking truly Christian, or merely politically expedient? The Weymouth Vikings' execution might reflect this religious confusion and hostility. If English authorities viewed all Scandinavians as enemies, regardless of religious professions, conversion wouldn't have protected the Vikings. Their ethnicity and warrior identity marked them for death, regardless of which gods they worshipped. Understanding the Weymouth Vikings requires looking beyond warfare to the domestic lives they'd left behind in Scandinavia. Lives shaped by harsh climates, agricultural cycles, and social structures that defined Norse culture. Women held significant roles in Viking society, managing households while men traveled on raids or trading expeditions. A farm wife commanded considerable authority, overseeing food production, textile manufacture, and estate management. She held the keys to the household, literally, with large key rings symbolizing her authority. During her husband's absence, which might last months or years, she made all major decisions affecting the family's welfare. Some women achieved even greater prominence. The sagas describe shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men, though archaeological evidence for such figures remains limited and contested. More certain is that some women wielded significant political power as property owners, priestesses, or influential wives and mothers of powerful men. Viking clothing reflected both practical needs and social status. Men wore wool or linen tunics, trousers, and heavy cloaks fastened with elaborate brooches that signaled wealth and status. In Scandinavia's cold climate, fur-lined garments were essential winter wear. The quality of cloth, the presence of silk, imported at great expense, and the elaborateness of jewelry all communicated social position. The runic alphabet served both practical and magical purposes. Runes could record mundane information, property ownership, debt records, messages, but also allegedly possessed supernatural power. Specific runic inscriptions could protect, curse, heal, or divine the future. The line between writing system and magical technology blurred in Norse understanding. Viking religious beliefs personified natural forces and made the world alive with spirits, gods, and supernatural beings. Beyond the major gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, countless lesser beings inhabited the Norse cosmos. Elves, dwarves, giants, and nature spirits who required appeasement. Religion wasn't separate from daily life, but woven through every activity. Education was oral and practical. Children learned through observation, participation, and listening to sagas recited during long winter nights. These stories transmitted cultural values, historical memory, and practical knowledge. A young man learned navigation by watching and doing, not through written instruction. Literacy in runes was relatively rare, limited largely to those with special training or social positions requiring it. Viking trade networks were surprisingly extensive. Norse merchants traveled to Byzantium, established trading posts in Russia, and engaged in commerce throughout Northern Europe. This trade brought exotic goods, silk, spices, silver, back to Scandinavia, while exporting furs, amber, and walrus ivory. The economic benefits of trade often exceeded raiding's profits. Family honor was paramount in Norse culture. Insults or injuries to family members required response, either through legal compensation or violent revenge. This created cycles of feuding that could last generations, as each act of violence demanded counter-violence. The saga literature is filled with such blood feuds, showing how honor obligations could destroy families and communities. Advanced scientific techniques applied to the Weymouth skeletons revealed information impossible to obtain through traditional archaeological methods. These analyses transformed bones into biographical documents, telling stories the Vikings themselves could never have anticipated. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel provided chemical signatures of childhood geography and diet. Different regions have distinctive isotopic ratios in their water and soil, which transfer into the food chain and ultimately into human bones and teeth. By measuring these ratios, researchers could determine where individuals spent their childhood years. The Weymouth Vikings' isotopic signatures confirmed Scandinavian origins. More specifically, the signatures matched coastal regions with significant marine resource consumption. The ratios were inconsistent with growing up in England, proving these men were foreign warriors rather than local inhabitants of Scandinavian descent. But isotope analysis revealed more than just geographical origin. By examining different teeth, which form at different ages, researchers could track movement through childhood and adolescence. Some individuals showed evidence of migration. Their early childhood isotopes matched one region, while later teeth matched another, suggesting families that had relocated, or boys sent elsewhere for fostering and training. The bone chemistry also revealed dietary patterns. The prevalence of marine isotopes confirmed that fish formed a major dietary component throughout life. The nitrogen isotope ratios indicated consumption of protein from high trophic levels, meaning these men ate predatory fish, seals, and whales, rather than just shellfish or small fish. This diet reflected both coastal living and relatively high status within their communities. Microscopic examination of teeth revealed the filing patterns in exquisite detail. The grooves were carefully executed, showing consistent depth and spacing that indicated skilled craftspeople rather than crude self-modification. Some grooves showed wear patterns, suggesting they'd been filled with some material, possibly colored resin, that had subsequently been lost. The precision of the work suggested this was a valued cultural practice, requiring specialized knowledge. Analysis of dental calculus, mineralized plaque on teeth, provided unexpected information. Microscopic examination revealed plant remains, protein residues, and even evidence of parasites. The plant materials matched species common in Scandinavia, but rare in England. The parasite eggs identified species typically associated with seal consumption and poor sanitation, reflecting the realities of Viking life. The bones themselves were examined, using techniques revealing microscopic structure. This analysis showed the men had experienced significant physical stress during adolescence, probably from intensive training regimens. The bone remodeling patterns indicated bodies that had adapted to extreme physical demands from young ages. Several skeletons showed evidence of specific occupational markers. The distinctive shoulder and back development matched patterns seen in modern rowers, confirming that these men had spent extensive time propelling longships. The hand and wrist modifications indicated weapon use, the repetitive gripping and swinging motions that came from training with swords and axes. Most remarkably, one skeleton showed evidence of a healed trepanation, a hole deliberately drilled through the skull. This surgical procedure, practiced across many ancient cultures, was sometimes performed to treat head injuries, or possibly to release evil spirits. The presence of healing bone around the hole proved the individual had survived the operation, demonstrating that Viking medical knowledge included sophisticated surgical techniques. One of the Weymouth burial's most puzzling aspects was the mathematics. 54 bodies, but only 51 skulls. The missing heads raised disturbing questions about what had happened after execution and what purposes the heads might have served. The practice of displaying severed heads had ancient precedent across many cultures. Celts, Romans, and various medieval societies took enemy heads as trophies, displayed them on stakes or walls, and sometimes preserved them through smoking or other techniques. For the victors, heads served as tangible proof of victory, warnings to potential enemies, and sometimes as objects of ritual significance. In the specific context of Viking English conflict, head-taking carried multiple meanings. Displaying Viking heads might demonstrate English determination to resist raiders, provide psychological closure for communities victimized by raids, and serve as propaganda, showing that Vikings were mortal and defeatable despite their fearsome reputations. The 3 missing heads might have been selected for special treatment. Perhaps they belonged to the expedition's leaders, men whose deaths warranted particular commemoration, or whose heads were taken to be displayed in more prominent locations. English authorities might have sent heads to the king or to other communities that had suffered Viking raids, spreading news of the victory. Alternatively, the heads might have served ritual purposes. Some medieval beliefs held that enemy heads possessed power. They could protect against evil, bring luck, or even provide oracular knowledge if properly treated. While such practices sound fantastical, archaeological evidence confirms that severed heads were sometimes placed in foundations of buildings, buried at boundaries, or incorporated into religious structures. The careful separation of heads from bodies at Weymouth suggested ritualized rather than haphazard treatment. The executioners had taken time to organize the burial, placing bodies in patterns and gathering heads together. This organization implied the event had social and possibly religious significance beyond simple disposal of enemy corpses. Comparisons with other Viking mass graves across Europe reveal varied practices. Some graves show similar head removal, others show bodies left intact. Still others show evidence of extended torture before death. The variation suggests local practices and attitudes toward Viking raiders differed significantly across medieval Europe. The psychological impact of the missing heads extends beyond their immediate historical context. For modern researchers, the absent skulls represent lost information. 3 individuals whose stories can never be fully told because crucial evidence is gone. For medieval communities, those heads represented power over enemies and safety from their possible return as vengeful spirits. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological warfare dimensions of displaying enemy heads. Chronicles mention heads placed on spikes at city gates, along roads, or at key locations where they would be seen by maximum numbers of people. The decomposing heads served as visceral reminders of power relationships and consequences of resistance or invasion. Advanced DNA analysis conducted between 2010 and 2012 provided final confirmation of the Weymouth Vikings' origins and revealed unexpected details about their diversity. Genetic material extracted from teeth yielded usable sequences that could be compared against databases of ancient and modern populations. The Y chromosome analysis traced paternal lineages across Scandinavia. The results showed the warriors came from throughout the Viking world: Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and even individuals with genetic signatures matching Eastern Baltic populations and Russia. This genetic diversity confirmed these weren't raiders from a single community, but a mixed force drawn from across Norse territories. The genetic findings supported the Jomsvikings theory. A mercenary brotherhood recruiting from across Scandinavia would naturally show such diversity. The men had united not through kinship, but through shared warrior identity and codes of conduct. Most poignantly, the DNA analysis allowed descendant identification. Modern Scandinavians submitted DNA for comparison, and distant genetic relationships were confirmed. People living today carry genetic sequences linking them to the warriors who died at Weymouth over 1,000 years ago. The final revelation. These warriors, though they came from different lands and perhaps followed different gods, died together and were buried together. Their executioners had tried to dishonor them, but paradoxically created a monument to their brotherhood. They'd faced death with courage their culture demanded, and their bones would tell their story centuries later. The inscription on their memorial today reads, "Warriors of the North. They died far from home, but not alone. Their names are forgotten, but their courage endures."